Well, Mr. Ken Lowry, it is a treat and a delight to speak with you today. I've really enjoyed the Wrestling with Christianity series that we've done with Jacob and Mahoon over at Sense Space. That's been wonderful. And over the months, I've really looked forward to those and had an opportunity to get into issues regarding, say, Christianity and the church that I think is a incredibly important conversation because I think there's a lot of people wrestling with these questions. Like, so for example, there's a lot of people that have a sense that the more secular, neoliberal, atheist, whatever term we want to use, world is lacking some sort of spiritual resource, meaning crisis. Then there's this idea of the systems leading to a meta crisis. But so then people are like, well, maybe we ought to rethink that religion thing. But then they go back to Christianity and they're like, well, maybe there's problems here. You know, what does it look like to go to church? And then you kind of have a feeling that some of the structure might be off in different ways, but then you also can see the value in it. And you find yourself in this perplexed state, this confused state, trying to figure out how to navigate it. But then, so as you're navigating that, that could be difficult. But then at the same time, there's increasingly more and more people, say on the liminal web or online, who are returning to some of these traditions and almost seeing them for the very first time in that T.S. Eliot sense, to be like, oh, maybe beauty, maybe there's a little more to this whole beauty thing than we realize. Maybe there's a little more to this community thing than we realize. So it's a very exciting time, but it's also a very perplexing time. But you do sense this openness to these religious questions or these religious institutions and philosophy in general that I think has been lacking for a very long time. So it's an exciting time. But I have really appreciated the chances to focus in on Christianity with you, on the question of the church, and then just your channel in general. You host such wonderful conversations. I really enjoy the flow of the way that you host the conversations on your channel, Climbing Mt Sophia. So thank you for being here today, Ken. And if I were to throw at you, on the question of church, where's your mind been on Christianity, how you think about these things, or any direction you want to go, it's a pleasure to have you today, sir.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here. Happy to talk to you. Yeah, I've really enjoyed our conversation so far and talking with Jacob. And thank you for your engagement with my work and your appreciation. That means a lot. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess, to sort of position myself at the outset, I find I'm always just sort of trying to reflect on where I find myself and then just resonate that with whoever I can find who will really, wrestle with me and try to move in some sense toward a more fitted state with reality. And so I find myself as a sort of post-Protestant Christian in some sense. I think that's maybe a good way to say it, because I grew up in an ultra fundamentalist Protestant situation, which to me really means something like a situation where someone has placed themselves in a subjective stance of claiming to have some sort of ability to interpret the Bible in such a way that they're going to do what they see in the Bible is right, and it leads to an unending hyper individuality. So I grew up in a context where it was church split after church split, but all the people I was engaged with, maybe not all, but most, seemed to be really genuine in their pursuit. They seem to really care. They seem to really want the good. And now, I've sort of left a lot of the Protestant aspects of Christianity behind because of the ways they're problematic, especially in the sense of the subjective absolute, or the absolutizing of the subjective, almost like I talked about there. But I find myself unable to really, say, come into communion with the more traditional forms of Christianity, be that Catholic or Orthodox. I would lean more toward Orthodox for reasons like apophaticism and those sorts of things. But I continue to find myself askance of them and wrestling with them. So let's see. I've been thinking about it a lot in terms of a home. And thinking about a home as the sort of dynamic positioning of where your longings can be, right? Like we think of a home as a place of belonging, So you turn that around, and it's a place that your longings can be. It's almost some sense of a place where you can return to, that is forever. It can hold who you are and also who you're trying to become. And so the question for me is, as we progress through a sort of, I think we're on the front end of a civilizational collapse in a sense. At least we're maybe in the middle of the collapse of meaning, which is the front end of the civilizational collapse. And a big part of that, when the Bronze Age collapsed, you got this, these huge titanic empires fall down, right? It's like a self-organizing criticality sort of picture. They fall down, and then you get small pockets of not individual, but small communities exploring on the boundaries, right? There's a valley crossing event. Everybody has to figure out a new place to be. And I find myself in those types of communities, right? People who, whether they're in my shoes as sort of a post-fundamentalist Protestant, or there's an awful lot of people who are post-fundamentalist atheists, that we're sort of seem to be finding ourselves in small groups that feel like home, whereas these larger institutions of like the traditional churches, for some people really close to me who've been on a similar journey as they find a home there. But for me, it's not a home, at least not now. And so thinking about this question of where do we find a home, and is it possible for the church as we've understood it, especially in a traditional sense, to be an arc through this, transition that we're going through that can really home people? Is that even possible, or is the way we've understood church, especially in the traditional sense, does that have to sort of go through this self-organizing criticality movement of falling apart and coming back together as well? Or maybe we move beyond Christianity. That is a difficult one for me for different reasons. But anyway, so I just threw a bunch of things on the table there.
Yeah, that was all excellent. And, a few things come to mind. I appreciate you describing your own personal journey. And something that always shocked me later in life is when you find out that a lot of the tenets that can define fundamentalist Protestantism, say creationism, a literal Genesis, then you go back and say, oh, actually, St. Augustine didn't actually believe in that. With on Genesis, the notion of a literal creationism is probably after the Scopes trial. It's a modern invention. Then the idea of the Bible not being a sort of invitation to a conversation of interpretation, that also is more of a new idea. And one of the sort of things you start to realize is a lot of the things that you kind of assume are truest and most fundamental Christianity are actually new. But it actually goes to show you why you kind of need the philosophy, if you will, or the philosophical journey, because all of these things are kind of given in the way they're presented to you, and then you find out they're not so given. But of course, the very act of philosophical assent, as David Hume calls it, of which makes you realize these things are not so given, is the same thing that makes it difficult to find a home. Because if you're kind of pulled out of something, then it's like, well, where should I locate into something? And then the very knowledge that you can pull out of something then makes all future embedded myths have more of a tentativeness to them. And so, for David Hume, the modern is defined by this philosophical awakening. He called it philosophical consciousness, where you realize that what you're born into could have been different or maybe not entirely true, which starts a philosophical ascent. But you see, with that ascent, there's two things that tend to happen to people. Melancholia, which is kind of the nihilism meaning crisis, where you're like, well, then everything's arbitrary. What can I believe? Or the other one tends to be a kind of pride, where you say, well, I'm better than all those stupid people. I don't need them anymore. And then you can kind of become the philosopher king, which for Hume is almost always a philosopher dictator. So for Hume, the name of the philosophical game is a return to common life, a return to embeddedness, with the philosophical awareness of which for him you also needed as self-defense. Because if you weren't able to think philosophically, it was only a matter of time before a political party, a leader, or whatever comes and manipulates you. But then you use your philosophical ability to defend and re-embed into make more alive and more beautiful, frankly, a common life, a community. And that's where but you have to do that re-embedding. And the question then becomes, how does one do that in re-embedding? what's the feeling of that re-embedding that you're looking for to determine where you should be and not. And this characteristic of a philosophical consciousness, I think, this kind of tension we're describing about being born into Christianity, kind of moving beyond it, but then asking, how do I return to it, but not in a fundamentalist way? I'm of the opinion that in a globalized, pluralistic world with media technologies like Virilio and talks about and so on, that this problem or condition, I don't know if I should call it a problem or a condition, is going to be more pronounced and more spread. And so figuring out this kind of return to Christianity, wrestling with Christianity, is similar in a way to everyone finding themselves kind of returning to metaphysics, returning to beauty, returning to these kind of principles, because it is quite clear that the human does not flourish very well without them. They're a kind of water that without we do not grow. So the first question that always comes to mind, and then I'll give it back to you, on this kind of notion of home. One of the reasons, like, what is the feeling of home? What's it like to be home? Well, if I was to go on a limb, a lot of it is the feeling of not having to think about yourself. And let me explain what I mean by that. Is when you're in a church, often if you have any philosophical training, you're kind of worried that you're going to stick out, or you're going to say something that's going to draw attention, or, you know, you're going to hear a sermon that says a lot of things. You're like, no, that has to be elaborated on. Or you're going to have a church where their engagement of conversation is not the same as you. So there's this feeling of, I might stick out. I might stick out. And that makes it difficult to feel home, because a lot of the feeling of home is a kind of, leisure, right? A kind of Sabbath, a kind of Kairos time, a certain sort of occupation. And one of the reasons why it can be kind of difficult to find a church is because if you've been through this whole process that we're describing, this return to common life, some people have called it deconstruction, some of the Christians have called it that, there are different terms, is this kind of feeling of, I don't want to stick out. But then if I don't stick out, that means I'm repressing, right? I'm kind of holding back. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly I definitely feel that. Especially when it comes to like a Protestant church, right? When the Protestant church where you have the classic, preacher gets up and gives a lecture, right? That's called a sermon. And that's always that's a big part of the reason I don't go to Protestant church. I don't go to church at all anymore, but is because it's so difficult for me not to just spend the whole time like, oh, come on, like what are you saying right now? But I want to move more in the direction of this, what you brought up in this sort of felt sense of home, because this resonates a lot with the notion of trust that I've been thinking about recently. And the trust has this, what I think trust is something like I'll use the word home. It's the felt sense of home in relation to the context one finds oneself in, that emerges as a consequence of a proper engagement with the world, with faith, and faith as da'ath, right? Faith in the sense of deep interpenetration connectedness with reality. And so I'll take that, if we've got that notion, I'll take that into this question of church and church as a home, because I think to the degree that church and a church or a movement of churches, an institution, or Christianity as such, whatever we want to call it, takes their own narrative, their mythology, their practices as ultimate in some way, or as absolute in some way, they require the trust to be placed, the home to be placed in a false layer of reality, right? And that creates what feels like a home for millennia, even, right? For generations of individuals, it can feel like a home until suddenly they find that they're in fact, reality's been here, and they started off maybe like this, but now, it worked for my fifth great grandfather on down to me, and now suddenly I find myself, struggling, falling through the air. And that's very much what it feels like for me. And when I come to brush against the church, right, and and that there is this deep, like, urging or like upwelling of a desire to just lock into that, right? To say, hey, you know, like, I'm gonna go join, like, say, the Orthodox Church and come underneath that, and that's like, I can do that. And that feels like, there's a sense that I know that would feel nice. But there, like, until as long as there's this other thing in my head that's saying, hold on though, like, there's aspects of this that feel like I'm just jumping on board this space station over here. And this space station, while I may be re-embedded here, this isn't re-embedded here in a complete sense, in a real sense. And I don't know if that's, I'm not saying that can't be the case for everyone. And I don't know if that's the case in a sort of absolute sense. But when it comes for me, when I find myself at home, when I find myself in trust, I don't find myself in a church. And so this, and this is where this question comes and I don't know if we can really answer it, because it seems like the sort of question that has to be answered for each individual, but they have to take it really seriously. They have to go on this philosophical journey like you're talking about, or at least a spiritual journey. You don't have to, like, necessarily deconstruct and understand all the philosophy, but you have to be very, very honest and bring all of your soul into the question of saying, is this really where I am to be? And is this really home, or is this a false home?
I think that was magnificent, and I have certainly felt those same tensions and completely understand what you're talking about. Because, you know, there's a few things. First off, when humans talk about the philosophical journey, he's not meaning like, oh, go read your Socrates and your Aristotle and go through your history of philosophy. It's more of where thought recognizes, wait, it could have been other. Because thought then engages in a kind of speculative knowing, as Hegel would put it. You could call it the wisdom journey, you could call the questioning journey, etc., so forth. It's where you realize that what is given did not have to be. And so there's a disconnect from it, which is freedom. There's a freedom in that, but freedom is terrifying at the same time, unless you can find how to rightly order it. And often what ends up happening is like where the Christians say they feel kind of free to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and then they're looking for a community to accept that freedom. But that freedom is a very threat by definition to community or any collective organization, because that means you have within you the possibility of pulling away from a collective organization. So freedom, as much as we may talk freedom up, brings with it a kind of threat. But you see, what's interesting is really the only way to find, you know, if we talk Isaiah Berlin, there's freedom from and freedom to. You know, your freedom from oppression and then freedom to play baseball. But there's also a kind of freedom before, which I think gets into what, you know, you've talked with Sindler and Pajot about, this notion of freedom before beauty, like humbling, like before it, you find yourself free in a thing. The only way to get to the freedom before is to move through the freedom from and the freedom to pursue the freedom before. So you have to go through the journey to get to the place where you can be lost in beauty. But that in of itself kind of structures as a threat to organizations, because then organizations have to humble themselves as merely being a place that for people to find freedom before something beyond the organization that cannot be reduced to the organization. And that right there has a certain threat to it that can feel dangerous. And so that right there, kind of what you're describing, in order for the human to find full freedom, there's something about it that seems to require organization and community that is simultaneously a threat to organization and community, and would require a certain kind of person to be able to handle that tension, right? So I think that's kind of a lurking question. On the point of on the sermon as kind of the truth, I think Protestantism is particularly in trouble given the trivia structure, where there's here's the answer, and like the school now reflects trivia, and basically a smart person is someone who knows the answers fastest. Likewise, the preacher tells you the answer so you can be good at Christian trivia. Protestantism is particularly in need of something aligned with a ongoing discussion like a liminal web, because it's aligning more so with kind of a Holy Spirit movement. and in the name of the person of Jesus. And so if you have a kind of Protestant structure that has defined itself as really being more of an individual following the Spirit, well, if you really then don't have an organizational structure to incubate people in their own personal journey so that they're located within a community, then they're especially prone to atomize. They're especially prone to enter into sort of nihilism. So the structure of Protestant church is particularly dangerous because it does naturally have more of an emphasis on a spontaneity. That's the whole kind of notion. And sometimes as an extremely speculative notion, I wonder if there's something where we see like between the Protestant, the Catholic, and the Orthodox, almost something like a Trinity church where you got the three persons of the Trinity, one essence. I sometimes wonder if the church actually is those three. Now, I know not every Christian church falls within those, but there's something about that I wonder about. And where, you know, as a speculative idea, and there's something where Protestantism in particular these days needs a kind of, and I'm not trying to attack it, but there's something where Protestantism and kind of leaning in this individual, spontaneous kind of individual really needs a very careful theology that's especially aware of the differences between freedom to, freedom from, freedom before. It especially needs beauty. It especially has to have a kind of subject that is attuned with the Spirit, and has gone about creating the exact opposite structurally and hermeneutically about how one would engage with that. So there's a kind of particular rehabilitation that has to occur there, which it can gain from some of, like, you mentioned orthodoxy, some of the thinkers who are really emphasizing, like Bukakov, the Sophia, you got Berjayev, you have, I know Hart does different works, like there's a particular lesson there that's very important. And then the last thing, I'll give it back to you, I think trust is extremely important here, because one of the most dangerous ideas is that trust is something you earn. Like trust, people have to do something to earn your trust. That's not trust. Trust is giving. It's grace. You just give it or you withdraw it. But to earn trust, the problem with the earning trust structure is that means I'll trust you if you pass enough Christian trivia games. If you say enough right things, then I'll trust you. And so that would mean that the feeling of home is a kind of stick up, a kind of like you have to prove that you're worthy of it by passing the trivia game and earning my trust. And then, of course, what that means is basically people experience questions as weapons. If you're asking a question about what the Bible means, then I shouldn't trust you because you're being difficult. When in fact, the funny thing is, what are they all doing with Paul? They're asking Paul questions. Like the whole structure of the epistles with Paul is, we have no idea what to do about this bread here that's on the altar to other gods, Paul. Can we eat it or not? Because if you're saying we can't, aren't you saying those spiritual forces have power? But also, wouldn't we be telling the pagans that we believe in their God? What do we do? Questions are necessary to figure out how you navigate a world that does not that does not make it obvious what it means to be Christian when you face something like that, right? So if you can't ask, basically what this means, and I'll throw it back to you, if questions are viewed as a threat, then Christians are not allowed to go about the practice of asking questions that is necessary to figure out how to navigate 2023. And so then they almost have to tribalize and atomize and isolate, because what else can you do? You're not allowed to try to figure out how to navigate these different things. And that all stems, I think, from a faulty understanding of trust as something you earn, and thus you have to pass the test, the trivia test, as opposed to something that's given in grace. So I think it's all related.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot there. That's really good. So I want to talk a little bit about freedom, just because I'm not disagreeing with you at all, but I want to just layer on my own thing to make sure that I'm understanding you correctly, because freedom has become something that it is so nuanced and so important for me. And as a quick backdrop, we talked a little bit before we started recording about how necessary it is to distinguish between the words we use and take time, especially with these really important words, but I would say more than words. I would say something like the idea, the essence, the eidos of particular virtues and particular orientations. For me, John Vervaeke's dialectic into dialogos has been profoundly life altering because it creates a space in which a virtue can come to life. And when a virtue comes to life for you, it displays all sorts of nuances and all sorts of perspectives that allow you to come into participation with it and thus alter your life toward it. And I found this to be the case with the notion of freedom, because, freedom is in the modern conception of freedom as the ability to choose between options is sort of, that's deep in the Protestant notion, understanding. In some sense, you could even say the modern notion of freedom grows out directly from Martin Luther and the Reformation. And I think there's good reasons for that happening, but it's really, I actually tomorrow I'm doing the last episode of the Freedom from Reality series with David Schindler, and which has been so helpful. But one of the ideas in relation to home is actually the Greek word for freedom and the original notion of a free man, as opposed to like someone who would be called a free man would be distinguished from the foreigner, right? So to say that Socrates is a free man of Athens is to say that he belongs to Athens. He is homed there. That is the place where he is born. That is the symbolic participation of which he is a part. The unfree man is the foreigner, right? Is the visitor, is the outsider. And so that's one of the ways that getting at this sort of freedom that is, and I think this is what you're talking about with the freedom before, where freedom is actually not, well, okay, I'll say it this way. I turned 30 a few days ago, right? And there's this thing about turning 30 and in my reflections on it, where there's something about youth that is now foreclosed to me in a way that it didn't feel like it was when I was 29. It's like when you're still in your 20s, you're still in this sense of, I have so many possibilities that I could actualize. And now it's like, as opposed to when I was 20 years old, now at 30, I'm married. I have a child, another on the way. I have a career. I have in fact made actual many of these possibilities. And as such, from a modern perspective, I am less free because my options have diminished. But I think from a real perspective of what freedom is, I am much more free because now I have the freedom to know, like the question is always, what's the best thing I could do right now? And I am so much more free now than I used to be because I know the answer to that question so much more frequently than I did when I was 20. When I was 20, it was like, I don't even know where I should go to school. I don't know what I should study. I don't know what, and now it's like, what's the best thing to do? Go play with your daughter, right? Go change her diaper, go wash the dishes, go make dinner, right? And it's like, there's not nearly so many options, but I know what the best thing to do is. And because of that, I can orient myself toward the good with much more trust, right? Because I've engaged in a world that has organized toward the good in a way that homes me.
100% agree. I think so. A few things. The bet, if you will, of, say, Francis Fukuyama and the notion of the end of history being the neoliberal capitalist order of the Washington Consensus was the idea that if you gave people choice, the freedom of choice, that would have the function of the freedom of belonging, or what some have called thymos, which is not merely the warrior, but also recognition. Thymos is an interesting concept in the classic soul. You have the logos, the eros, and the thymos. And Francis Fukuyama was basically like, well, if we kind of lean into the eros and the logos kind of notions of freedom, that will take care of the thymos, and the thymos will go away. The jury seems to be in, and that is false. You do not address people's need for the freedom of belonging, or the freedom of before beauty, or the freedom of trust. You do not do that by increasing their options. And basically what ended up happening is that in economics, there was a notion that human rationality actually could provide belonging, which is to say that if I say this is rational and then I do it, I feel belonging in it because I know it's rational. So the idea was that rationality could provide a feeling of home because we would find fittedness in rationality. The only problem, as I like, as I'll put it sometimes, is the true isn't the rational. meaning that what is rational is relative to what you believe is true. So, for example, if I think it's going to rain today, it becomes rational to bring an umbrella. But let's say it doesn't rain. Does that mean I was irrational? No, I was rational relative to what I believed was true. It just turned out it was wrong. So it's possible to be rational and false. It is possible to be rational and wrong. That is not what some Enlightenment thinkers thought. They thought you could, if you were rational, you'd always be right. But that is not the case. And in fact, what is rational is constituted by what we believe is true. And we find belonging and freedom in truth, not rationality. Rationality is the means to truth, but it is not a simile with truth. Well, then the question is the following. What do you believe is true then? Rationality can't tell you, so you have to use other non-rational, not irrational, non-rational means by which to determine that. Things like trust, faith, aesthetics, beauty, community, etc., emotions, and so on and so forth. So the idea that increasing choice, which would increase the probability of experiencing something rational, which then you could find freedom in, was based on an incorrect conflation of truth and rationality as categories. And basically the jury is in, and that does not apply. And freedom is found much more in something like trust. I think we've also don't understand that actually choice and freedom can be opposites. The more choice you have, the more you can feel like you're not free because you can't figure out what to choose. You can feel anxious, actually. Well, that would suggest, and then I'll give it back to you, which I think speaks to a role the church is supposed to have, that freedom is more so not a matter of mere choice, although choice is a condition of freedom, but it is not sufficient to describe the whole of freedom, right?
There you go. Yeah.
So you could say it's necessary, but not sufficient is a way to word it. You have to have choice, but it's not sufficient. You have to have more than it. Freedom is, in its fullness, is not primarily a matter of choice, but actually a kind of conditioning. You have to condition yourself to experience reality a certain way that makes you find fittedness in it, which requires you working on yourself, but also conditioning reality to be the place that those conditions within you can so resonate, right? Like there's a certain condition of an organization that is more receiving of people who have met a certain conditioning that then has a kind of feedback loop that the sum of that would be like a similar talk is more like the beauty, the dance, the beauty, that kind of togetherness. And much of life, freedom is found more so in conditioning yourself for a kind of dance and then finding the conditions of that dance and those two coming together in a kind of marriage and a kind of partnership, right? That's the fullest form of freedom that you need the freedom of choice to find and then it to be meaningful because you chose it. But the freedom of choice itself will not necessarily be equivalent to that. In fact, it's kind of like, it becomes kind of, it's almost, it's kind of in Christianity where if you don't make it to God, then every step along the way to God actually just becomes part of hell. Like you have to kind of make it in order to have the light go through the hole. So likewise, choice actually becomes the anxiety of hell if it does not ultimately find its fittedness in the dance, if you will. And in that way too, that's where, if choice and Protestantism and the church is simply creating choice, but it is not creating dance, then actually, unfortunately, it can unleash upon people the anxiety, more of a hellish anxiety, as opposed to a kind of heavenly belonging. So you can get the exact opposite of what you're trying to do because you don't ultimately lead the choice into dance. Yeah.
Which I think is a really good place to just throw on the historical lens and say, I think that's really what's happened.
Yeah.
Right. Is that the motivation, right? Before we started recording, you talked about intrinsic motivation as being possibly the most important thing to maintain in raising your children. And this for me, probably my most significant personal metanoia was a shift toward intrinsic motivation toward the good, right? And that like there was a moment where that really landed and that really happened for me, and a big part of it was I was so bound up in a Christianity that had all these notions of truth, faith, hope, love. All these things were bound underneath a fear. A fear of hell, right? A fear of eternal damnation, a fear of being disconnected ultimately from reality itself. And that was so then all my motivational structures for pursuing anything with any of those terms attached to it was first negative. right? And so the moment of transitioning that to an intrinsic desire to move towards those things for their own sake, regardless of the outcome of my particular, regardless of whether hell is real or not, regardless of my particular fear of hell, was huge. And as far as I can tell, so many people, definitely in Protestantism, but even in most of the people that I know in traditional churches, engage with it because of a fear of what will happen if they don't. Right. And I in my knowledge of Christian history, there's different places that comes in, right? Pope Gregory the Seventh is a big one, right? In around 1000 AD, like those sorts of things. And I think that's really where things break apart. And in some sense, this is where I'm really careful with critiquing. I wish I was more careful than I am about critiquing the church, because I feel that I often do a very significant anachronism where I look back through the lens of this fear of hell Christianity towards the church and can only see that versus this homing to heaven, I think is how you said it, which I really like. I really like that turn of phrase, right? That the walk of Christianity is an ever increasing sense of home in the kingdom of heaven, versus and if that is tainted, and especially at the motivational level, with a fear, then it is in fact the opposite of what it's trying to be. Because I mean, yeah, if you're starting with a fear of hell, if you're starting with a I need to save my soul, then ultimately you're still running original sin. You're still running the I'm the God of the universe that needs to be preserved.
I think that's very well put. I think also this kind of idea of reading the fear of hell back into the history of the church is also a massive problem. I think that's exactly right. I think, well, there's a few things. So if there's anything that Jesus teaches against, it's fear. He's constantly saying, don't be afraid, but don't be afraid. And I think we've talked about it before. To me, fear is more so the opposite of faith than doubt. Like doubt is a refinement of faith. Doubt is just an inevitability, but fear is kind of the opposite of faith. And I would also say that fear is the opposite of wisdom. Like you could kind of argue that the point of wisdom is a point of wisdom, in addition to the figuring out what constitutes the conditioning for the freedom found in beauty and so on and so forth that we were saying. It is likewise to learn to tell the difference between fear and wisdom, actually. Because how do you tell? A lot of people can't tell the difference between what's a fear and what's wise, right? They're like, oh, well, you're going to run out of money if you don't do X, Y, and Z, or this could get you hurt. So it all sounds like wisdom, but it's actually fear. And being able to tell the difference between fear and wisdom is arguably the difference that, that's huge, to be able to tell the difference between life and death. And so I think that's really important. And so if we have a fear-based Christianity, then you could argue it's like the exact opposite of Christianity, because the whole point of Christianity is not to be afraid. And so fear, it's really like, if you wanted to talk about like not spiritual warfare or whatever, like, it's like Lewis saying the best trick the devil ever did was convince you he didn't exist. Like, what a fantastic strategy, really, like to make the entire motivation of Christianity the opposite of the spirit of Christianity. You can't do much better than that as a kind of demonic trick.
Exactly.
And that's really what has occurred in many respects. And
it immediately becomes the structure of the Antichrist at that point.
Exactly. And you see, I think the mistake of Protestantism, in my opinion, is, you mentioned the Antichrist, that they have associated the Antichrist with a government structure or a structure of power, and not enough with a disposition of a subject. And fear, I think, is the spirit of the Antichrist. Fear is the spirit of the it's been too much located in this kind of government takeover, conspiracy, power, big brother kind of thing. Like the metaphors that Protestants will describe the Antichrist is basically totalitarianism of some kind, right?
Yeah.
The problem with that is, while you're busy then looking for that, you're not paying attention to fear, which is the spirit. So it becomes a trick, really.
And it's actually the thing that instantiates it within your own soul.
Exactly.
Right.
That's exactly right.
Because that is the spirit. The spirit of the Antichrist is the attempt to control all things.
Yes, that's a
Right?
great way to put it. Yes, absolutely.
And so yes, it is. It's not that it's not the totalitarianism, but if you're worried about the totalitarianism, you're going to start being a totalitarian for yourself.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
The phrase Michelle and I will throw around is "what you fear is what comes unto you." Like if
Oh yeah.
you're afraid of totalitarianism, then you start acting totalitarian, and you know, and that's also what you see. If, in my opinion, that's kind of the defining what has happened a lot with Protestantism. It's this kind
Very
of
much.
this fear of the world's after us. You know, we're in the world, but not of it. The world's after us. We got to stop it. It's very powerful and totalitarian. And so in that fear, it is then become to itself totalitarian and monitoring and a surveillance state and all that, because they project that onto the world, actually. And you see,
Yep.
what you project tend to be what the image, you know, we tend to become the images we see and that we look on.
Yep.
That's why art and beauty and all that is so important, because we tend to condition ourselves and become like what we look at. Well, if we're always seeing the world as out to get us in a surveillance state and power, then we actually become that to ourselves. And I think that has happened.
Absolutely. And in fact, like we've, you know, it's the I don't know, trying to I want to use a good identifier here, but the far left in the political and cultural conversation in America is very, very keen on pointing out that to be that especially just sort of mainstream Christian middle class person is the powerful position, right? And I don't think they're wrong about that, and I think that should be paid attention to, especially from this angle, because like we have created a surveillance state, right? Over the past, especially since 9/11, the amount of privacy available to the individual American has drastically decreased, precisely because the fear of the people who should not be afraid has just spun us down. And I think, you know, this is, I want to throw in here too, like for me, all of Christianity comes down to the question is Christology for me. It all comes down to, what does it mean for Jesus to say that Jesus was fully God and fully man? And for me, Christianity it really comes down to the encounter with the person of Jesus and the existential bringing to bear of your entire sense of being in direct confrontation with the person of Jesus and that question, right? The question and the proposal that, in fact, at a particular point in history, God, the fullness of God, became man and died and rose again, right? That breaks you. I continue to bring myself as much as I can into that confrontation, and it continues to just destroy me and build me back up, right? It does this thing to you. And in order to do that, right? In order to do that, you have to really take seriously, your own life. You have to really take seriously the unknowability, the impossible mystery that is underneath you and beyond you, right? No matter how much I know about the world, it is impossibly mysterious to me, beyond me. And no matter how much I know about myself, I am impossibly mysterious to myself. And I exist in this place between. And when all of that comes to bear and you really come to grips with this question of the infinite God and man, and then fully coming together, I think what you get, and what the, like, where it really comes together is this sense of like, because you can't know any of it, right? All you can do is come into that existential posture and recognize that somehow everything is already okay, right? Like, because that's what that Christ idea is that if God became man, and this death and resurrection taking on the sins of the world business is like, okay, it's over. Like, and this is that the whole idea of eschatology, right? Is that it's all over. You're just playing in it, right? You're just playing in it. So if you start from this place of saying, I'm fully coming into my own inability to know, fully like doing everything I can to come into accountability with this person, this instantiation of God in man, then I can actually come to a place where, not on the level of my rationality, not on the level of my map making, not in the level of my semantics, but on the level of my existential being, come into a place where I say, it is all already okay. Then you can flip over. And that's when you can live from a place of saying, resist not evil. It's like, Jesus's absurd statements. Resist not evil, and if your enemy takes your cloak, give him your coat as well. These sorts of things. It's like, if you really take that seriously, it goes against everything you know.
I really appreciate what you just said. A few things come to mind. Often I think that the presence of fear is evidence that a Christology is too weak. Like, if fear is present, that would be evidence that the life of Jesus is not taken seriously enough. And this kind of also this emphasis you're placing on wrestling with the notion that God became man at a point of history. We don't read Paul right, in the sense that what Paul is basically doing is, okay, if that really happened, what does this mean? We have to think through we have to think through everything differently. We read Paul as a source of dogma, which is a massive mistake, as opposed to a situational reasoning, which is a mixture of the tradition with the progress with the radical. And basically the church is we're supposed to be doing that same kind of reasoning that Paul is doing now. I'll talk about the First Testament, the Second Testament, and the Third Testament, and Paul's the Third Testament. We're still under the Third Testament. And church is supposed to be a place of that kind of situational reasoning, and a community that is together trying to figure out how to be like the life of Christ, not merely choose his atonement. And what does that look like? People like Scott McKnight, N.T. Wright, they've all emphasized that we placed way too much emphasis on the death of Christ. Basically, the life of Christ is just getting him to the cross. And so you basically skip all of that and then and then the only book in Romans you read is, the only book of Paul you read is Romans, which gives you what Harold Bloom called the Romans Road. And then that's where, into the great debate on Paulian theology is do we actually understand election, justification, so on and so forth? There's a lot to be said on that. I think there are a lot of unfortunate mistakes that have come from that. And also, what happens is when you lose what Paul is doing, then interpretation and conversation are threats. Whereas Paul is basically saying the only way to do Christianity is a perpetual conversation and situational reasoning.
Yeah, and if you get the story upside down, right? Like, if you get the story of Jesus upside down, you get the story of creation upside down. And by that I mean that it's fundamentally about saving me. Right? It's somehow like some sort of metaphysical fire insurance to keep me from some terrible ultimate fate, which is not what it's about. I'm sorry, it's just not right. But if you think that's what it is, then all of these questions, predestination, all these other things, and if the atonement's the point of the whole deal, it just, it all gets so, all these disasters happen exactly as you're saying.
Well, and it's not reflected in Paul. This is the issue. Paul does not write as if that's true.
It's have you ever read it?
Yeah, Paul writes as if the atonement is this is how so what we tend to do is so Jesus lived his life where he lived the life of Jesus to the cross. We're actually supposed to start on the cross and then live like Jesus. Only Jesus could lead to it, because you said it very well. If it's already finished, then why not look at the birds of the air? Why not stop judging? Why not live in joy? The cross is because Jesus bore the cross, we can start assuming the cross and that victory is given, and thus live like Jesus. You see, but what we've done is we're following the model of Jesus. Well, he lived his life first and then to the cross. So basically the cross was the point, That was the whole point of the life of Jesus. But for everyone else but Jesus, it's the opposite in a way. You start with the cross, which is the guarantee of victory and joy and beauty everlasting, and then you live like Christ. You see, that's why Christ is kind of different. Like his life, like the life of Jesus leads to the cross, but for us, it's the cross and then live like Jesus. If you stay on the cross, you're literally staying at the starting point. Like you're literally staying at the guarantee in a way that's supposed to free you to then live in like the seeking of wisdom, beauty, truth, and goodness, community, and all these different things. We've literally created Christian church to keep people at the cross. As if when for Jesus, he ended at the cross so that we could start at the cross as the guarantee to then to do everything Paul's doing, thinking through situations, engaging in dialogos, looking for beauty, seeking conditioning. Like we've literally confused the end point with the starting point. And that's simply because we are projecting the sequence of events that happen in Jesus's life onto our own, which really we're supposed to be like Jesus, but we can't equal Jesus, right? You know, there's a difference, a very slight difference there that's important. But you see, in getting that incorrect, and also we make the mistake because we're bound in sequential time. We assume the end of the story is the most important part of the story. That's also a fallacy. The end of the story is just as important as the whole. The end only has meaning because of the whole. And you see, because we do that, you then get a theology that makes it all about the cross. When then, of course, you could also just say, well, didn't he rise from the dead? See, that's the thing. Like, you actually don't even go to the end of the story. You stop at this middle point, treat it as the end, then forget about the rest of the narrative when that isn't even reflected in Paul. That's the thing. Like, when you read, like, people read Romans, but what about Galatians, Corinthians, like all the other books in the Third Testament? They do not reflect the reasoning of someone who thinks that Christianity is simply a choice to get to heaven. It's not reflected in the thinking or life of Paul or the formation of the community. So it's based on a projection. Well, this is the funny thing, and then I'll give it back to you. When you say try to avoid the interpretation or the challenge of interpretation, you still interpret. You just have one, and it can't check and balance itself. That's the problem. Like when you deny interpretation as a kind of evil, because basically that's what kind of is a postmodern threat or whatever, as opposed to invitation being the space in which the person can enter the dance, then what ends up happening is you have a single interpretation that tends to be absorbed from the zeitgeist of your day with all of the values and notions of right and wrong that are projected onto the text that then make it very difficult to even see the text through. And then you end up in all of these problems. And I think that has what has occurred. And then, of course, like from the position of all of those problems, you have an idea of what salvation is. That is a choice of Jesus as your Lord and Savior that's based on a kind of neoliberal notion of choice, which doesn't even necessarily follow. So that's the crazy thing. Like the fear of hell can be leading people to acting in a way to avoid hell that could be playing straight into hell. Now, I'm not trying to be like a nervous, but this is the funny thing. You act out of fear, and then what you fear is what comes unto you. And we certainly, let's put it this way, the way that the church can act can feel like the anxiety of hell, right? Well, if that theology creates the anxiety of hell, are we so sure that it is not unintentionally contributing to hell or these kind of dark forces? Those are all the things you start to ask if you start kind of looking at these things. So one should not be so quick that just because they're doing X, Y, or Z theology to save souls or to spread the mission of Christ, there's then the assumption that that is saving souls and spreading the mission of Christ, when that may not follow. Now, I'm not trying to make everyone a nervous wreck, but if you take that seriously, then you're going to, engage in thought, philosophy, and trying to go back to the text. It actually will inspire you from a place, what it shows is that fear cannot be the basis of faith. Like fear always turns around and it comes in at different angles, and you could always pose it, well, what if? So it just deconstructs. For me, the point of showing how fear can lead to this unintentional irony, the fear of hell unintentionally plays into hell, shows you that fear is not an adequate basis of faith, because it can always come from a different angle. So that's a negation sublation. That's where in Hegel you move from one side to the other and show it's inadequate. So you have to move to things like beauty, love, trust, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think you're bang on there, because no matter what hell may be in some sort of absolute metaphysical sense, it is necessarily the experience of fear, suffering, meaninglessness on earth.
Yes,
it has to be at least that. But I wanted to go back to So this is one of the things when I talked about the question of whether or not the church can actually be a legitimate home. There's the personal question. I'm not sure if it can be for me, but in a broader, in the more generalized question is, can it be a home? And I think that for me really hinges on where and how it holds the narrative, because I think one of the things that is significantly contributing to the continuing fragmentation and destruction of Christianity in the modern world is the recognition and acknowledgement of the sort of strangeness about the historicity of the narrative as it projects forward from Christ, from Jesus. And that is that, this idea of the end times, this idea that, there's some sort of apocalypse that happens. There's all this, the apocalyptic thinking that just completely overwhelms our Western society. Like the most atheistic person is still a massive apocalyptic thinker when it comes to anything political or cultural, social. And that is so deeply embedded in us. And I feel like that to me is maybe one of the most significant places where Christianity, if it's going to survive, has to transcend itself. Is that the coming of Christ and the person of Jesus in history and the living forward from the cross in the way that you're talking about require me to disassociate and let go of any hold on some sort of future end time narrative. Like, we have to open up the future. We have to allow for the possibility that not that the revelations and the sorts of foreshadowing of the end of days and the end of the age, actually, which is a much better way to translate those sorts of things, actually mean transitions between levels of being human, transitions into new ways of living, in the way that we transition from the Bronze Age to the Axial Age and from prehistory into history, right? Like, we go through these transitions. Ages come and ages go, but a holding to a deep sort of metaphysical sense that there is actually an end of time as we know it is, for me, I think, a disastrously foolish thing to hold on to. And it is so deeply rooted in, as far as I can tell, I see glimmers in the Orthodox Church where there's, and maybe it's because I don't know Orthodox well enough, that this is in fact not held to. Like, they have a very different conception of time. And Jonathan Pajot doesn't seem to hold to it very strongly. He seems to be pretty interested in holding the apocalyptic stories and all that as symbolic patterns, not sort of going to manifest historical events. But yeah, I think that for me is one of the big things, that if Christianity is to be a legitimate home, that it has to the church has to rid itself of a sort of narrative endpoint of history and apocalyptic thinking.
I agree. I think that has been very destructive. I think there's a bunch of things, like, if I'm not mistaken, like, Augustine didn't want to include the book of Revelation. There were a lot of like church fathers who were kind of like, this is not good. And it's too easy to misunderstand. It's very interesting. Like, the history of the notion of apocalypse is much more debated than clear. Now, a way that I would put it, it's quite clear that Jesus seems to mention something about the apocalypse, but then it's blurred with stories about the falling of the temple, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's quite clear that there is a line, the lion laying down with the lamb. There's some sort of new creation. It is not the business of the Christian to worry about the apocalypse or to even think about it, because once you do, it is too difficult and seemingly inevitable that it comes to function in service of ideology and inaction. And basically, it too easily fits into a narrative of, we got to get everyone to choose Jesus and get off the planet before it burns up. It has too much, like, if indeed there is some sort of apocalyptic narrative of Christianity, that's not your business to worry about. And if there, like for me, it's kind of like if the apocalypse is going to happen, then it's not a factor in thinking. You cannot think it. The reason you cannot think it, there's a paper in the Map is Indestructible. We talk about death as the event horizon of reason. Because if you say, if we basically the problem with the apocalypse is it justifies anything. If I say you must do X or the world ends, then you must do X. And you actually shouldn't even waste time thinking about it, because the more time you waste thinking about it, the problem. So the problem with apocalyptic thinking is it destroys thinking. It cannot be thought. And so this is what it would mean. In order to think the apocalypse, the evidence will need to be remarkable, precisely because it is such a threat to reasoning and is too easy to be used by power in service of power, right? We see that now, right? Everywhere, exactly. So the arguments for apocalypse have to be overwhelming. They are not. They certainly are not in a clear, straightforward manner. And so for Christianity to make it so central to their thinking is quite an issue. And it's also very clear that second coming, there's a rapture notion of second coming that is very questionable. There's also a notion of second coming as when history is redeemed, right? You see, the notion of second coming, it's kind of this, we're all going to be going about their business like this kind of knife is going to cut through reality, and we're all going to be caught by surprise, and oh my gosh, what's going on? And it's kind of like a gotcha moment. The way that the second coming is described is a kind of gotcha moment, as opposed to a lot of the language of the Bibles almost suggests that the second coming will be something that people like you're preparing for, and you see the king coming. It's not a got you at all. It's like we're making a new creation and heaven is coming to earth. Like the notion of Thessalonica of going into the sky and meeting Jesus. That's what you did for a king coming into town. And then you went, here's the thing, you go up into the clouds to meet him and then come back to earth with him. The rapture is not like this idea of going away. That is based on a conception after the Enlightenment that is, you get into the first millennialism, second, all of that different stuff. But the notion is the second coming is described, and it almost should be the return of the king. That's how I like to use Tolkien's language, right? The second coming has this kind of surprise terror to it, where the return of the king is the redemption of new creation. And that you have to remove the surprise element, because surprise feeds into what? Fear, anxiety, we're going to be caught off guard. And also the other things, and then I'll give it back to you, like we've treated hell as this kind of is the thing that you're going to get surprised and thrown into. And we don't see hell as part of the doctrine of evil will be punished. Hell is for evil. Like that's kind of the idea. And like the notion of evil being punished, or the things that have pillaged and murdered and caused so much suffering, that's a wonderful thing. The notion that in the end there will be justice and that God will punish evil. But the problem is we can't think that now because evil equals people that didn't know Jesus. And so the entire idea of justice can't even be like the idea. The Christian justice is actually supposed to be grace. It's supposed to be a doctrine of grace, but we can't even, now it's justice versus grace, which leads to all sorts of confusion versus the notion that like hell is justice for evil, not your neighbor who didn't know about Jesus. Now we have to get into the entire doctrine of salvation and justification and all these different things. But we currently have a conception of salvation that puts justice and grace in conflict with one another. And that also kind of treats reality as one day you're going to be surprised and caught off guard, which then you can't engage in kingdom work. Scott and Knight, they emphasize like Christians has engaged in kingdom work. Well, we can't think that because we're too afraid. We're too nervous. And what's the point if God's going to destroy it all in some sort of fiery apocalypse, right? So there's all sorts of problems that emerge, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I like how you mentioned justice and grace as sort of antagonistic, right? Where I think, I don't think you can understand justice until you understand that justice functions on the basis of grace. Grace is the thing that allows for justice. And I in my morning practice, part of it is reading Socrates' quote. And the quote that I read this morning had to do with, I won't get it correct, so I won't try, but it had to do with that it is beastly to punish a person for what they have done. The only reasonable option when engaging in punishment of a person is to hopefully craft their action toward the good in the future. Mm-hmm. Right. And our modern notions, like I see so many of our political cultural things going on in this conversation that we're having, because it is in fact the distortion of these ideas because of, I think, fear and a diabolical way of approaching Christianity and a diabolical manifestation of Christianity, as sort of paradoxical as that may sound, throughout the last, especially 500 years, but really probably 1,000, that has led us to this modern place where we have this massive, massive confusion because we've elevated compassion to the highest virtue, right? And justice, like compassion and justice, are our two highest virtues, and they are in this ridiculous relationship where justice demands an absolute retribution, right? A retributive redistribution, actually, right? Because justice is all about power, who took power from whom, and you have to give it back, right? But also you need to be punished for it, right? That's what justice is, and compassion is a completely sort of almost it's like complete grace. It's absolute grace, elevated above everything else. And these two things, like the sort of average cultural values at the moment, are trying to hold these two things, right? And they're just crashing into each other, especially in this like Israel-Palestine conflict, right? These things are just smashing against each other in a sort of, it's people who are able to myopically focus on just the Israel-Palestine situations can make it fairly straightforward because they're very concerned about genocide. Side's more powerful than the other, that sort of thing. If enough cognitive dissonance, you can make it happen. But if you zoom out a tiny bit, you realize that, well, our entire modern post-World War II morality is based off of an identification of absolute evil as the Holocaust of the Jews, right? That's our reference point for morality in the modern world. And it's like, well, now you've really got a problem, right? Because if these are your things fighting against each other, it's just and thus we live, right, in an absolute meaning crisis, torn apart by the ways in which the diabolical has manifested through, I would say, the Christian tradition over the past 1,000 years.
I think that's exactly right. And I would also note that basically without something like philosophy or situational reasoning, it is not possible to keep grace and justice from beating against each other, causing all of this confusion, because they are inherently values that exist in a kind of tension with one another. And without philosophy or the ability to think through conflicting values, you're going to just get caught in politics, basically, and overreaction, underreaction. There's nothing you can do. There is something about philosophy that has a certain stabilizing factor to it, the ability to handle. And so and it's an entirely different subject, but as you've been asking on the kind of idea that King Church be a home, I've been kind of asking of, is democracy possible? And going back to Tocqueville. And what's really interesting, I'd have to expand on this claim. I'm increasingly convinced that democracy is philosophical discussion. It is basically the liminal web. And we've confused democracy way too much with a voting process, when democracy is more like a cultural of idea exchangement. And that's what creates that's also how you can get things like nationalism and patriotism without it being problematic, because then nationalism and patriotism simply describe the feeling of belonging and home that you have in the midst of that philosophical exchange, of which is, of course, dialogos, circling. And it's, like Sindler was saying, that gathering under, like Socrates gathers people under the question toward a kind of home, kind of pointing. That's actually what philosophy can do. And that's also what democracy can do. when it's at its finest. Now, why exactly democracy seems to be so difficult to hold is because I think it worked in America because we had a frontier that could be a source of vision and imagination. And once we lost that, then democracy became a management as opposed to an envisioning. It lost vision. And as a result, democracy became mere process. And basically, to regain democracy, we need to regain vision, which would require basically beauty. I mean, I've gotten to the point where the fate of beauty is the fate of us, is what I like to say. And basically, the fate of beauty and, you know, the loss of beauty in Christianity is a problem. But the reason I say all this is because democracy is impossible without vision. Home seems to be impossible without vision. And the church seems to be impossible without vision. And the only way to have vision is for people to be gathered under it by something like philosophy. I do think it's possible for the church to regain that, as I think it's possible for democracy to regain it. But we have to think about these things more so as, it's almost like the difference between structure and engagement. Like, we have to think of church more of a kind of engagement with one another and democracy. And the stakes are, if we do not regain that ability, then things like grace and justice and all these virtues are always going to be in conflict with one another, and we're not going to be and then we're going to be susceptible to power, because whenever you're anxious and unsure, then that's when power sweeps in and says, I got you, I know what to do, and you fall into a strongman or something. So the stakes of the political and the church and all of that are very, very similar. And the thing is, like with the doctrine of hell, for example, because the possibility of hell, in the same way that the cross is supposed to kind of liberate you to live like Christ, the possibility of hell is, in the end, those of whom are truly evil will be punished for it. So do not worry about judging. Do not worry about trying to determine somebody is evil or not. Only God judges. You try to figure out the political situation. You have the discussion to figure out how to manage it, and the truly evil will be punished by God. There's something to be said about the possibility of hell actually being a grace, because it removes from you the worry of judgmentalism. But instead, what we've done, and McCall Wolf, in his book Exclusion and Embrace, talks about how basically the only way to get tribes to stop killing each other in the Balkans was to tell them the idea of hell. And so the cycle of revenge could stop, because if in the end God was going to punish the evil, then I don't need to go kill that guy for killing my cousin, because God will take care of it. So it had a grace in it. And so the possibility of hell in that sense can bring about a kind of grace, and it can free us to then situationally reason about how to deal with, say, Gaza and Israel, the church and culture and different things. But because we're stuck between hell, stuck between kind of apocalypse, we've got grace and justice split, and we're thinking about a choice of the atonement, not a life of Christ in light of the atonement. Then we end up in this place where we're at the mercy of these values conflicting, and they lead us to a place of a kind of madness and anxiety. And then, of course, home is not possible.
Yeah. I think that's beautiful. And I think also, you know, that notion that the fire of hell and the fire of God's love are the same fire, right? Add that to the aspect of hell as grace. But, you know, I really like Lewis's conception of hell in The Great Divorce. I think that's really helpful. And because anytime there's an absolutization of something, right, is when you get in trouble. But hell as being this sort of continual refusal of God's love, like that's a pretty good definition of hell.
I think so. I mean, the notion of like, if you end up in hell, then you will have always been in hell. If you end up in heaven, you were always in heaven in The Great Divorce. And also that critical notion that hell is locked from the inside. Like
yes, exactly.
So, that's so important, because hell then is a certain relationship to God, not a where you hate God. Like you want nothing to do with God, and that is what tortures you, as opposed to some of the Protestant structure of God it's the absence of God, which doesn't make sense, because God is everywhere, so you can't really have an absence of God. It has to be a
technically impossible.
God. Yeah. And so when we talk about hell, it has to be a certain relationship where you hate God, right? And so the idea is, then the difference between salvation and damnation is the love of God versus the choice to believe in God. Well, here's the thing. If it's all about the love of God, loving requires conditioning. You have to
Mm-hmm.
condition yourself to love someone, and not once you move. You know, there's love as dating and of infatuation, but then there's love as marriage. What the
Mm-hmm.
love of God is a kind of marriage, and that takes a lifelong work.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we kind of the problem is we actually describe salvation almost like dating or falling in
Mm-hmm.
love is how we describe it. You kind of just fall in love. That is a very incomplete notion. And you see, if
Yeah.
loving God is salvation and loving God is a lifelong work that requires certain conditioning versus a
Yeah.
kind of nervous anxiety, which is what can define a lot of marriges, then that's an entirely different ballgame. And it makes me think, and I know we're coming up on the end here. I've enjoyed speaking with you, and I appreciate your time today, Ken. And it makes me you were saying how when you were young, there's this idea that as you get older, you lose choice, right? That goes into
Mm-hmm.
culture. And Gurdjieff, who I was speaking with Parallax and everyone,
Yeah.
his kind of idea is that as you get older, there's supposed to be something that comes out of you. Like there's
Mm.
something like age is supposed to be a process of a certain quality of life or something coming out of you. And freedom is found in that aging into
Mm.
your body is the garden of your soul in which the soul grows per
Yeah.
se, and your soul can only come into fullness as you get older. And so you move from the lowest form of freedom as choice into then choosing the conditions in which the body will age to then make a certain quality of life blossom. And that quality of life seems to be two sides of the same coin of the kind of love of God that is salvation. And that also
Mm-hmm.
spreads kingdom upon the earth. And so
Mm-hmm.
it has to be beyond a choice. It has to be more like a conditioning. And then if we think, and it's easier to think those ways once we kind of move beyond notions of kind of surprise, second coming, apocalypse, hell, and we can kind of see Christianity as a kingdom work. And that, and again, what's just wild is you hear that and you go, oh, well, that's kind of new. But really, the kind of idea of people choosing Jesus and getting off the ship before it sinks, that's a modern notion. That's
Yeah.
a newer concept. When you go back and you look at the different history, you have people thinking about Christianity as a kind of building of a kind of kingdom. And then the last thing I'll say before throwing it back to you, I mean, another way to think about like hell is like, hell is for all of those principalities or notions of the good that can rationalize evil. Like, when God
Mm.
shows up, then this is the good. Oh, okay, there
Mm-hmm.
is the beautiful, and all the notions of the good that are actually just ways to rationalize fear or to rationalize evil. That is what hell is for. It's for those principalities and those kind of notions and spiritual forces that serve that. And isn't it a wonderful thing that those rationalizations will not be included in heaven, in new creation? How could new creation be new creation and if it entailed the principles and the zeitgeist of that rationalization, right?
Yep.
So those have to be removed. And again, Paul's always talking about principalities, God of this age, Lord of the air. Like there's this notion of a certain invisible organizing principle of human beings that leads to all of the suffering. And that's what hell's for, right? And then,
Mm-hmm.
the spiritual forces that defend that. And so, that has to be removed for humans to flourish,
Mm-hmm.
right? And philosophy then is basically the getting those principalities out of your head, getting those sources of fear out of your head. So they're all part of the same process, the same pilgrimage.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. That's really well said. I think I'll end with this. You spoke of it as a garden, life and your body is a garden for the soul. And I think that's a really good way to understand it. I think it's so much better to understand what it means to be a human being as a being who cultivates a way of being, cultivates a story, cultivates a garden. And because that gives so much more of an open-ended aliveness to reality. One of the biggest problems with the hell notion that we've been problematizing is this sort of mechanical way that you seem to be locked in beyond death, right? It's like you get to live, it's like here's the ground and you sort of pop out of it, like you're thrown into it at your birth and you get to whatever here. And then once you go through this, like you're locked in on one side or the other. And it's this very mechanical binary way of understanding reality. And the way you understand your beginning and your end dictate how you understand everything in the middle in some sense. And I think having a sense of a much more open-endedness and a much more alive sense of death, really, right? Like, we don't know what's on the other side of death. We don't know how. I mean, I've had a lot of experiences that would seem to indicate that it's not nearly a binary closed space. And a lot of other people have as well. And I think that there's really no reason to think it's not, except just to think that we know things. And so having an openness about what happens after we die, and a sense of life as the cultivation of your own being, your own story, and your own community, rather than a controlling of destiny or something. That's what's important.
I think that is very well put, and I very much enjoy speaking with you, and we'll have to do it again. I always look forward to it. And I think what you just described points to how church could be a home again, how it could be a place of belonging. If it removes these kind of notions that kill the conversation, if you will, that kill the sort of, because, you have this idea that where two or more are gathered, the Spirit will also be there. Do we think that means like sitting at a couch watching TV? Is that what we think two or more gathered? It probably means some kind of conversing. It probably means some sort of engagement. And really, there's a way in which church right now has people sitting next to each other in the pew, but they're not actually together. And so the Spirit cannot be there. And there's something about the necessity of philosophical, democratic, theological, Christian discussion that Paul emulates, that seems to be the necessary condition in which the Spirit can be present. And if the Spirit is present, then you can have that home and belonging. And I think the removal of apocalyptic thinking, I think the removal of this kind of neoliberal single choice thinking, what would church look like if it understood that it had to cultivate a condition where the garden of the body could grow the flower of the soul, if you will? What would church look like if it understood that it had to gather people under a sort of principle of beauty that like Sinlu was saying? It would look very different. And I think it can do that. I think it can. Has to remove the trivia structure, has to remove the idea that the point of Christianity is to have the right beliefs, as opposed to sharing axioms to explore the unknown. There are axioms. There are a shared mystery of who was this man of Jesus. You can have a shared belief with a strong Christology without having dogmas. You can have that shared intelligibility, but the shared intelligibility comes from the sharedness and the exploration of the mystery, which then gathers people under that mystery to then take that into the world and figure out how to live that in their job, in their communities, in their different works, because that's the work of spreading of the kingdom. And that is also a form of Christianity that is not bound by fear, but the opposite of fear, which is faith. And ultimately, I do think faith is inseparable from a conception of beautiful, good, and true, because we tend to have faith and live our life according to that faith in that of which we experience as beautiful, good, and true. Otherwise, our conception of faith has to be a kind of closed-mindedness, which then, of course, is fundamentally fear. We have a conception of faith now that is basically a form of fear. In order for faith not to be that, it has to be bound to the beautiful, the good, and the true, which I think is possible. But that work has to be done, and channels such as yours and conversations like you're having are helping with that work. So, Ken, thank you for your time today. I've enjoyed it immensely.